to talk on the topic of a critical analysis of Namibia's road to recovery and possible solutions. So this was very interesting to me because I'm usually asked not to be too critical, so it's quite interesting when I'm asked to be critical in the title of my speech. So I really hope that I don't disappoint. I think I must commend one, however. It's very nice to have a lineup that's so packed with technical people and to hear very technical assessments of the situation rather than these being interwoven with specifically politics, but also other points of interest. At this point in proceedings, I think it's also important to point out that I've decided today not to use slides. I think that given how long the talks have been so far already, there was a very high risk of death by slides. So I thought I'd skip that and rather depress you with my words rather than my pictures. But actually, it's quite interesting. Usually, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with the old joke, if you have two economists in a room, you're bound to have at least three opinions. But I think much of what's been said by the economists that went before me is actually quite agreeable, which is very strange. We don't usually have consensus, and we're not sure how to deal with it. But perhaps the one or two things that Solomon and I will disagree on, we can bash out in the school car park tomorrow morning. Anyway, I think the context of this talk is quite important, and I think we have to start some history before we go into the future. I'm not going to go too far back in history. I'm not that old, so I can't go quite as far back as I would like. But I think it's important to go back to the pre-COVID period before we talk about the COVID period and finally conclude with some thoughts on what lies ahead. So COVID added fuel to what was already, at best, a smouldering fire. Some may say that there were flames, but at best it was a smouldering fire. The economy in the 5 years before COVID had shrunk approximately 1%. And on a per capita basis, it had shrunk by about 8%. So the country and the people of the country were getting poorer pre-COVID. At the same time, debt-to-GDP had doubled in the 5-year period building up to this COVID shock, with over 40 billion worth of debt being added to the country's debt stock over that period. Foreign exchange levels, reserve levels had improved quite a bit, but this was more linked to two, let's call finite levers, being the repatriation of foreign or Namibian pension fund assets that were invested abroad, and also external borrowing. So these are not long-term structural improvements, but rather shorter-term transitory levers that have been utilized. Unemployment was exceptionally high, and really exceptionally high. And I think that this is a very important point that I was scratching my head when Prof. Hausman was talking about how many people outside of this room, outside of the eastern part of Windhoek, would really agree with his very rosy assessment of the situation. And I think that that's quite important and perhaps something that one doesn't see so easily from Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I think is very important when it comes to the assessments that we do in the country. This unemployment was amongst the highest in the world for young people, 7th highest youth unemployment in the world. And employment had been deteriorating for quite a while in the build-up to COVID, the COVID shock in 2020. So we've gone from 27.6% unemployment at the sort of peak of economic times down to 33.4%, an increase in unemployment to 33.4% by the time the last labour force survey was done, as the chairperson of the Statistics Agency points out in 2018. But also there's been a deterioration in the quality of employment. So there's been a big increase in non-cash earning employment. So people that were doing subsistence agricultural activities, unpaid in-kind family work, etc., etc. And there were fewer jobs in the formal sector. So we've seen an increase in unemployment as well as a deterioration in the quality of employment that exists. And as we like to remind people, the year before COVID hit, Namibia was the 20th slowest growing economy in the world. So COVID certainly added fuel to this fire. I think the reason for this slowdown that we've had over this 5 years is probably relatively well known and understood. Ricardo puts it down primarily to a decline, but I think that we can fairly say on which we've become probably over-reliant as well. As well as this, we had an abrupt end to a construction boom. Part of this was linked to commodities, so we had 3 mines being built that all came to a halt within 2 or 3 years of each other. But also a big slowdown in private sector construction activity more generally, particularly in the wholesale and retail space, and also some other construction activity from the public sector. I personally ascribe much more of the decline in economic activity that we saw domestically to the oil price collapse than I do to our own minerals. And if you look at our own minerals decline in prices, this was led the slowdown in economic activity that we had by about 4 or 5 years, whereas the oil price collapse saw a mass exodus of Angolan economic activity from the country. And I think that that was a far more direct impact that actually caused much of the shock that we saw. And then finally, I think that we did see an increase in what, as an economist, I can quite happily say is bad economic policy. So I think it's unfair to ascribe the decline to any single one of these, but a combination of these factors, I think, was the reason for this decline. From a bad policy perspective, basically what we saw is people saying, we're just going to wait and see before we reinvest our marginal dollar back into this economy. So we didn't see a mass sale of assets, we didn't see a mass exodus of funds, but we saw people being a little bit reticent when it came to investing their additional dollar back into the economy. This might not be that clear in all the data, but if you beat the streets as we do and talk to the real economy, you'll find that this is very much the case. There were other issues, of course, but I think that these were the 3 main ones, and I think we have to take that into account when we look forward. In the current point in time, I think we sit with a very immediate challenge that it goes beyond COVID as well, and this is the challenge of deficit funding. Government has been running large deficits for an extended period of time, and there's a very big question mark this year about where the money to fund the deficit is going to come from. And that can return us to a difficult situation similar to that we last saw in 2016 when liquidity really dried up within this economy. In addition to that, I think we see a very interesting situation from a political economy perspective, something that I certainly wouldn't have said 5 years ago, but it has become much more relevant over the last few years. We could be looking at our first major political upset. I'm not saying this because Dr. Achulis here, I'm afraid it's more an observation of statistics. But we could be seeing our first real political upset in the post-independence period. And this is a very interesting question from the technical perspective that I come from, where I'm very politically agnostic with regards to the situation going forward. In the last 2 elections, we saw a very material change in support for the incumbent party, first in the 2019 elections, and secondly in the 2020 local government elections. And COVID has no doubt added fuel to the fire that caused this change in political behavior. This change, as we see it, is largely driven by young people. The voter demographics of the country has changed materially over the last 30 years, as I'm sure you can imagine. And these young people, the ones that the chairman of the Statistics Agency talked about, I think are becoming very, very politically influential. They're also largely unemployed, largely living in informal housing in urban settlements, relatively educated with limited future prospects. And I think it's very understandable to see why that can result in changes of political behavior. It's strange when I talk about this in a democratic country, I'm looked at like a heretic standing in front of a church. But anyway, I think it's important to keep in mind and do with that information as you will. So this is the bad news. I think we sit with a very difficult situation on our hands, and it's one that will take us many years to recover from. I don't think that there is a silver bullet to this problem, to this set of problems in this situation. And going back to the pre-COVID world, the pre-COVID world had enormous inequality, enormous poverty, a lot of people left behind, very high levels of youth unemployment, etc., etc. And we need to do better than the pre-COVID world, not just go back to what we had before COVID hit. The good news, however, is that we know what to do about this. It was very interesting listening to Prof. Hausman talk and actually agreeing with quite a bit of what he had to say, because much of it is what we've heard in this economy for a long time, whether it's the Mutingas, Kalilis, Gaumaks, that staplers that talked about this 10, 15 years ago, or myself and others that have been talking about it more recently, with the authority of the Harvard badge behind him, which probably doesn't hurt. But I think we know what we really need to do, and I think that that's the good news. So, as the saying goes, let's not let this crisis go to waste, and let's look at how we can do those things. And that's what I want to focus the rest of my talk on. Now, Ricardo spoke extensively about investment. He just does it in a bit more of a veiled manner than I do. I talk about it very abruptly. And the reason that I think his method is probably better is he doesn't get accused of being a capitalist when he talks about investment, so I probably should take some notes. But the reason that we talk extensively about investment is because investment really is the key to building back from the economic situation that we see at the moment. And when I talk about investment, people imagine a suit-wearing foreigner. I especially wear my suit today, lest people think I'm talking about myself when I talk about investment, but mainly because I put on weight, it doesn't fit me. But people think of a suit-wearing foreigner with pointy shoes and a briefcase full of US dollars, and most importantly, a condescending attitude towards us Namibians. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about, at least not exclusively, we're talking about investors generally, whether it's small local investors, whether it's foreign investors, whether it's existing investors or new investors. We're talking about people who want to deploy their surplus capital or the surplus capital of others through the intermediation systems that we have or should have in the country into creating additional economic activity in the country. We're talking about broad-based investment. We're not talking about one or two large-scale projects. But the reason that investment is so important is that there are only a handful of components of GDP, as I think many people will be aware. The largest component of GDP in Namibia is households, but households are largely tapped out. What we've seen over recent years is that household incomes have been falling. You can see this in consumption activity, you can see it in compensation of employees in the national accounts that Solomon's team so nicely produces. But the reality is that household incomes are falling. Whether it's on per capita terms, in inflation-adjusted terms, household incomes are falling. And households also sit with very high levels of debt, so their ability to borrow from incomes of the future, on marginal borrowing from income of the future, is very challenging. And as a result of that, households are not really in a strong position to be stimulating growth going forward. If we want households to become an increasing contributor to GDP, i.e. a contributor to growth, we need household incomes to improve. In order for household incomes to improve, we need more employment. That is the primary method. As we like to say, what's easier to double a household's income? To double one person's salary, or to have a second person in that household employed? And if you want to generate surpluses, if you want to get people out of intergenerational poverty, employment is also a critical factor. So we need more jobs. And in order to get more jobs, we need more investment. The second component of GDP is government. Government is largely tapped out too. Perhaps this is one of the things that we'll box on in the parking lot at the children's school tomorrow morning. But government does not have huge capacity to borrow. And we can't realistically compare Namibia to many of the other nations that you see in some of these charts. Mauritius, for example, borrows at about a third to a quarter of the cost that Namibia does. There's also much smaller percent of revenue that are going to service debt in countries like Kenya. And as a result of this, we need to look at the country specifically and not just a peer comparison. Because of this, I think it's fair to say that government is largely tapped out. In order to avoid causing an austerity spiral when revenue took a dip back in 2015-16, government has maintained expenditure at more or less the pre-crisis, let's call it, levels at between 65 and 70 billion Namibia dollars a year. This is pretty much stable in nominal terms, but if you adjust it for inflation, government is spending less in this economy. But at the same time, is running major budget deficits, particularly over the last two COVID years and looking forward into the next year as well. So the idea that government can spend more and stimulate us out of this situation, I think is a little bit unrealistic. So government expenditure is certainly not going to be a major driver of growth. In order for government to increase expenditure, which I think is obviously desirable over the long term if done sustainably, again, more jobs are needed so that more personal income tax after the personal income tax in the shop, and more corporate tax needs to be collected as well. But doing that from the current economic base, as Solomon has explained, is going to be difficult. Namibia has one of the highest revenue to GDP ratios in the world. This is certainly boosted by SACU, but we have one of the highest tax revenue to GDP ratios in the world. And increasing government's share of that, when government has a much higher propensity to consume vis-a-vis private sector's propensity to invest, is not going to be long-term beneficial. And we have to take that very seriously. And I'll circle back to that later. The third component of 2 minutes. I barely got started. I think you forgot a 0. So, the third component of GDP is net exports. Again, we're not going to reduce imports or increase exports in a beneficial manner without investment. So investment really is the key to many of these problems. So what of investment? What is happening with regards to investment in Namibia? Investment as a percent of GDP in Namibia is less than half of the emerging market average at the moment, at 16%. Investment into fixed capital is the lowest that it's been since before independence. So we're not seeing people committing to fixed capital in the country at the moment, and we're not seeing our historical net FDI flow levels of between 1 and 10% of GDP. Instead, we're seeing net outflows in 2019 and 2020, the latest data that I have available at the moment. This is not really surprising. If you look at corporate arrears, doubtful loans and write-offs, they're at record highs. So it's difficult to be a corporate in Namibia at the moment. The liquidation roll is the longest that it's been in memory. I spoke to a number of liquidation lawyers recently. They say they've never seen the liquidation roll so low. In addition to this, retrenchments are at record levels. It's difficult to be a corporate in Namibia at the current point in time. And this is the core productive part of the economy. Over the last few years, before and during COVID, we've seen a hollowing out of balance sheets. So corporates are less well positioned, and households are less well positioned, and government is less well positioned to drive growth than was the case beforehand. And this is a very real, very difficult situation that we need to deal with. So what do we do about it? First and foremost, if we want to address the problems such as those that Solomon mentioned around the nature of our labor force, the nature of the persons that there are in the country looking for employment opportunities, if we want to develop the country and improve the lives of the majority, we need to make it much easier for small and medium businesses that are clinging on for dear life to survive and rebuild the remaining shocks of COVID. This particular event in the healthcare responses there too, something that I think Namibia actually did very well at when compared to many other countries around the world, was no normal event. And while I'm never really in favor of supporting failing businesses, I think this is an exceptional situation and we need to look at it differently. We need to ensure that as many businesses as possible can keep their doors open, continue to employ, continue to contribute to value addition in the country. And in order to do this, we won't propose handouts, but we need to remove the regulatory and tax burden that sits on these small businesses' neck. There's a desperate need for government to change focus from asking more of private sector and businesses to support and help drive these businesses' recovery going forward. And so that I cannot be accused of mincing my words, the impending dividend tax is the polar opposite of what is needed in this economy at the moment. This tax is a tax on the struggling, productive part of the economy in a time when corporates can't handle it, and it comes so that government doesn't have to reform a bloated wage. This is unacceptable and untenable over the long term. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. We believe that radical reform is needed in 6 key areas, so that we give those that lost jobs through COVID, or those that never had jobs before COVID, a chance to rebuild or build their lives, either as an employer or an employee. Key in this is that these reforms are aimed at ensuring grassroots recovery. These are not specific reforms aimed at large mega projects, specific projects, people with access to the presidency, Minister of Finance, Minister of Trade, etc., but broad-based reforms that can benefit the economy more generally. And so that small investors can enjoy the benefits of such as much as the large investors with access Very cognizant of the available skills and expertise in the country and the specific challenges that we face. The first one, as I'm sure you all guessed, is tax competitiveness. I won't go into my disagreements with the comments that Prof. Hausman made at the end of his speech with regards to how reducing tax hurts government and blah, blah, blah. We can talk about that in the question section because my time is probably running out. But we need to be tax competitive. I'm not talking about tax compliance. You should pay your tax as per the law. And the number is quite right to come after those who don't. I'm talking about tax competitiveness. 32% corporate tax rate that we sit with here is a tax on capital. When money is in the hands of a business, it is capital. Irrespective of whether it's an increase or a decrease in the capital of that business, it is capital. That tax on capital is a material drain on businesses' abilities to grow, on businesses' ability to create future jobs. And our view for this is that if you really want to get investors' attention, do something dramatic on that front. We like to talk about cutting it in half. This would put about 5% of government's total revenue at risk, something we believe you would recover in the space of about 3 years. It's unlikely that that would ever happen. However, I think something dramatic on tax to make us tax competitive would attract a lot of attention from global investors, and I think it would help to get things on the right track. But if you don't believe in that, if you think that that's unrealistic, how about we look at this single-dimensional system that we have, where, you'll excuse me for singling you out, F&B gets exactly the same treatment as Sylvester's Welding down the road here, when it comes to corporate tax, when it comes to regulation, and similar. We have to take this seriously. Our corporate sector hasn't reformed the way that it should have in the last 30 years. It looks far too similar to how it did 30 years ago. And one of the reasons for this is that we kill small businesses before they get an opportunity to grow. And a large portion of that is the 1/3 shareholder. That's the worst shareholder you can have, who gets in your way, makes it difficult for you to do business, and then demands 1/3 of your profit every year, irrespective of whether the other shareholders are taking anything out. This is a very difficult situation for small businesses. It has much less of an impact on big business with established revenue streams, with established profits. For small businesses, it's often the thing that closes them down. I don't need to go into a lot of detail on the difference between cash and profit, cash available and profit. I think that we can perhaps discuss later on. If you need to understand the difference, go and look at a company that's busy being suspended from the South African exchange. The second thing that I think is very important is that we need to keep ahead of the times with our VAT thresholds. The VAT threshold hasn't been increased now for 6 years. This is disproportionately disadvantageous to small businesses and to new investments. And we need to make sure that the VAT repayment process is much, much smoother and much, much less burdensome on small businesses. We can talk about tax compliance for private sector and private individuals. We need to talk about the same when it comes to government side of the agreement around tax. The second key thing in my list of 6 is access to capital. Access to capital is obviously a material challenge. And if you consider around most of the world, the first source of funding for new businesses, for small businesses, is what we call friends, families, and fools. Namibia has a history that's excluded many people from the accumulation of assets, or the ability to accumulate assets. This is something that's often incorrectly referred to as the economy, but this inability of certain groups to accumulate assets because of the historical situation of the country presents a very large problem for a large number of Namibians who don't have a network of friends, families, or friends and family that have access to capital that they can lend them in order to start businesses. And we have to look beyond this if we want to try to get more businesses started, established, and growing to the point where they can access venture capital funds, private equity funds, bank debt, etc., etc. This is quite critical because fools, contrary to popular belief, are much harder to come by than we realize. The third key thing is our labor market and labor market reform. The big challenge that we sit with in Namibia is that we look at the labor market as if it's a point. We act as if that every single portion of our labor market can be treated exactly the same. And that is obviously not correct. From an economic perspective, it's a curve, not a point. And demand for such is exactly the same. You have some high-skilled people, a relatively small number in Namibia, some medium, some low, and some ultra-low. This is the nature of labor. To have a one-size-fits-all model that says we can't allow foreigners to come and get work permits here, or we must make it as difficult as possible because we have enough people, is not a realistic way to approach this problem. And we need to consider demand and supply of labor across that curve. At the same time, we definitely shouldn't be letting in a lot of unskilled labor, where we have a material surplus thereof. So we need to be a lot more dynamic around our labor policies and around importing the skills that we need into the country. The fourth point that I'll just go through very quickly is exchange control. People don't put money into a country that they can't take it out of. If they're not confident that they'll be able to take their money out of the country, don't expect material investments to come into the country. The fifth point is policy. We've heard a lot about policy uncertainty over the last few years, and how policy uncertainty is the critical challenge that we sit with. Personally, I think certainty of bad policy is just as bad. It's strange, but we keep talking about policy uncertainty as if we make bad policy certain, people will suddenly invest. They won't. We need to get our policy environment right, which means we need to move away from a nationalistic, inward-looking policy. It was a sucker's game when Trump did it, it's a sucker's game when we do it. We need to look at being part of the global economy, not a little insular North Korea on a better continent. Further to that, we have to do what Ricardo mentioned and look at how do we grow the economy and make sure that that growth is shared. You'll excuse me for making this comment, but I don't believe that the likes of oil, mining, and particularly green hydrogen will do that. We need to look at broad-based measures that will create growth across the board, not for a handful of industries, a handful of entities. We need to look at how do we align the growth that we can see in this economy with the labor that's available, the people that are available, and similar. I won't go on that too much longer. The sixth point, general bureaucracy. There's a material cost, non-tax cost of doing business in Namibia. And I think you can put this down to two things. We have a lot of rules and regulations, and those rules and regulations are inefficiently, in many instances, not all, implemented. That's a very dangerous combination. If you have a lot of rules and regulations, you need to implement those rules and regulations very efficiently. If you don't implement them efficiently, you need to reduce the number. And I think that that's something that we really need to look at in the Namibian instances. I'm nearly done. Well, not that nearly done, actually. Namibia, I think, can very easily be viewed as a gateway to Africa. And I think that it should be viewed as the place in which you house your holding company for exposure to the world's last major frontier. That frontier that still has the most growth potential of any. And I think that the benefit of the reforms that I've talked about previously is that they don't require a lot. They don't require a lot of capital. They don't have long lead times. They don't require complex technology. They require the swipe of a pen. And I think that this is the real benefit of this type of reform. It can be implemented quickly, and the world will sit up and notice, and Namibian investors the same. Moreover, I think that these changes would make our good friend Menangula at NIPDB's life a lot easier. And who in their right mind wouldn't want that? The reality is that mega projects, whether it's green air, commodity prices, and oil, should not be ignored. But these should not be the foundation of our recovery plan. Our recovery plan needs to be founded in something that does not represent one basket with all of our eggs in it. It needs to be a far broader type of recovery that provides options and opportunities to many more people than these single projects and single sectors ever do. At the same time, I'm very opposed to picking winners, another battle to be fought in the school parking lot perhaps. The problem with picking winners is that you're limited to the ideas of the people who make it to the ring. And it doesn't matter how smart the people in that room are. They may all have a Harvard badge behind them when they present in Zoom. We need to make it easier for everyone, not try to pick winners where the smart people in the room think that there's a chance of success. But unfortunately, my solutions are way less sexy than saying we need to pick this or pick that. It all sounds very pro-business. I see I'm going to get chased off now. It all sounds very pro-business, and I think perhaps it does sound that way. But we don't argue for unfettered free markets. Namibia is comfortably in the bottom half of countries when it comes to ease of doing business. And if we want to expect business-led job creation and revenue long-term, we can't expect this if we don't reform. So we're not saying go free market, we're saying become more business-friendly. And we don't expect to replace some of the countries at the top of that. I think it's, as well as our business-focused reforms that I've mentioned, we do have a number of other recommendations that we make around socioeconomic reforms, but I don't think I have a lot of time to go into those. I'll mention 3 quick points. Firstly, it's high time that the highly regressive communal land system undergoes material reform. The veterinary cordon fence that's being attacked in the press and elsewhere at the moment certainly has no place in our society, but it's a symptom of a problem. The far greater problem is that a person living on the northern side of that fence has completely different options in life to someone living on the southern side of the fence. And if you think about how important to you ownership of your primary asset of land or property or a house is, in terms of your ability to generate wealth, maintain wealth, pass on wealth to your children, this is an absolutely critical thing that has to change. And I think people will tell me that it's complicated, it's difficult to do, and so on. I say if the same energy were deployed into that as is being deployed into an odorless, colorless gas, far more would be achieved, and moreover, what would be achieved would be a much more equal society with much less poverty, and economic metrics would follow from that. We also need a dramatic reprioritization of budgeting, show leadership, and do the deep cutting reforms that we know and have known about since the days of State Leadership, etc. Thank you.